Welcome! You've heard the saying, nothing brings people together like good food. What if that food was presented to you through stories? This is Sophie, the food blogger behind A Kitchen in Uganda, and what you're listening to is our new podcast called Our Food Stories, a podcast where we as a community share food stories from our past that have raised and sustained our ancestors and eventually ourselves. Remember when we were younger and whenever it was time for supper, our parents would tell us stories, and these stories would range from Bible stories to folklore to family history. Better yet, when was the last time you had a meal that brought back memories of the past? Maybe memories of a loved one, memories of a place you visited in the past, memories of relatives, or memories of the good old days. These are the feelings that I want this podcast to evoke for you. So, why are food stories? To be honest, this podcast has been a long time coming. I started blogging in 2012, and in 2014 I transitioned from a personal blog to a food blog, and it has been 7 years since I wrote that one post that changed everything for me. But in the process of writing A Kitchen in Uganda, it increasingly became clear to me that I could not tell all these stories by myself. I was just one person. And the more I researched, the more I heard stories, the more I found out about some of the food that, we don't even hear about anymore, the more I realized I actually don't know anything. And I remember one day in 2015, if I remember correctly, I had an interview and somebody asked me, what is one thing you have learned from writing this blog? And I told them that writing this blog has taught me that I don't know anything. I really don't know anything because, what I knew was what I was exposed to. But there was a whole world out there filled with people's stories that were just waiting to be told. And so the more I wrote this blog, the more I got convinced, the more I got the conviction to tap into these stories so that we can both learn something. And I found that 2021 was just the perfect timing for this idea to come to fruition. Around this time last year, in November 2020, I got the opportunity to be one of the presenters at the World of Flavors conference hosted by the Culinary Institute of America. And this was such a big opportunity for me. So I did my research in advance and I extensively looked at resources that I had access to, mostly online. And it became increasingly clear that this podcast was supposed to happen. Because the more I researched, the more I realized that, there's a disconnect between what we know, this generation, the millennial generation, what we know, compared to the generation of our parents and grandparents. The food stories that they tell us are different from the food stories or the food that we eat now. And I was really interested to find out why that was. So as soon as I finished the conference, I started writing the ideas down because I really wanted to explore this. And the more I wrote the concept of the podcast, the more I realized this is not something I was going to be able to do alone. And I was going to need the help of you, of the community, of the A Kitchen in Uganda community that we had built over the 7 years. This podcast is not going to be any different. It's just an extension of the blog. And the only difference is that I am not the one telling the stories. It is going to be you telling these stories because I have told my stories for the first 7 years and I believe it is time for you to tell your stories because I know you have them. And so with that background, I introduce to you Our Food Stories, a community podcast for us and by us to tell our food stories that have been passed down onto us by our elders, both living and departed. On this podcast, I challenge you to listen to these stories, to visualize these stories, because there's a lot of wealth and knowledge that is going to be shared. The podcast will feature Ugandans from all walks of life, all corners of the country, who have a story to tell. If you'd like to contribute to this podcast, please reach out to me on Instagram at A Kitchen in Uganda, and I will send you the details on how to contribute to this podcast. So sit back, relax, and listen to our food stories. The first episode is dropping very soon.